My garage floor is pretty typical. It has a lot of pitting, or what they call spalling. It has some grease stains, there's some salt crusted on there, it even has some polyurethane that I spilled. And in the next 10 minutes, I'll show you how I both resurfaced and epoxy coated this floor. Let's start the clock. If your concrete looks like this, I highly recommend you resurface it because it will help your epoxy adhere better and it will extend the coverage. Any imperfections in your floor, like bumps, ridges, or spills, need to be scraped off because the epoxy won't stick. You can use a putty knife for the sticky stuff, a wire brush for the crusty stuff. For the really intense spots, you may need a wire brush attached to a drill so you can grind it. Loose or flaking concrete should be scraped off until you get down to what's solid. For grease spots, spray, scrub, and blot. Some grease spots may not come out because they're embedded in the pores of the concrete. When in doubt, just prime it later and that will help the epoxy stick. Give it a good sweep, and to get all the dust out of those pores and pockets, I highly recommend you power wash it. For this, you'll want to cover anything that shouldn't get wet, and you can tape off the gaps in the baseboards. Here you can see all the dirt that's coming loose, and this is stuff that would never get picked up by a broom. When you're done, you should be left with some gritty bits like this, which is good because it means the pressure washing has broken loose any brittle concrete, and you can just go ahead and sweep that up. I've tried a couple different resurfacing products, and I prefer this one. It comes in 20-pound and 40-pound varieties. Depending on how much coverage you need, I think it's worth it to go ahead and get the bigger one. I put a little spray of water in the bottom of the bucket to make sure that part gets damp. I pour in about half the bag of concrete, and then I alternate spraying and mixing little bits at a time until I get a consistency that's about like a thick mayonnaise or a very creamy peanut butter. As you're kind of approaching that consistency, just add little bits of water at a time to kind of creep up on the right mix because a little bit of water can go a long way. You'll know when it's ready because it kind of clings to the mixer, but it's nice and smooth without any clumps. Before applying it, I like to wet the concrete down just to make it a little bit damp. That helps with adhesion. In other words, slightly damp floor concrete making contact with your slightly damp concrete mix. I like to keep the trowel pretty damp, and that helps it just kind of glide across the concrete. And I also try to keep a wet edge. Keep working it outward from the center and definitely put some effort into it to make sure that it gets into all those pockets. You can lay it on up to about 1/2 inch thick. Continue working out from the center until you've covered all the little pockets up to about 1/8 of an inch wide. Your last pass with the trowel can be to smooth out any creases or ridges. You can feather the edges until it's almost flush with the surrounding concrete, and to do that, I like to use a putty knife so I can apply a lot of direct, concentrated pressure. Or you can use a float, which is basically like a trowel with a rubber face on it, and that helps give a nice smooth finish where the concrete mix is really thin. Any little clumps that form around the edges or places where you can kind of really see the granules of the concrete mix, you don't want those anymore. Just kind of scrape those up and discard them. And any little dried bits that start to form on the trowel, scrape those off and keep it nice and clean. Don't bother trying to reuse them. It's really not worth it. When it's done, the thickness should be very consistent. Although the surface can tend to be a little chippy, it's hard to get it really perfectly smooth, especially in thin layers like this. Wait 24 to 48 hours for it to dry. You may see some inconsistencies in the color like this, and that's a lot of times due to mineral deposits in your water or in the concrete itself. And then I went over mine with a wire brush just to try to knock down all those edges that I couldn't get perfectly smooth. I gave the whole thing a firm brushing, and that helps break loose any concrete that may not be adhering properly or may be just a little bit too thin. Then I swept everything, I waited a few hours, and then I went over it with a vacuum because there's a light film of dust that settles on everything, and a vacuum's the best thing for getting that up. By the time that was done, it was super clean, almost clean enough for me, and never mind. We want to seal off any cracks. This is the product that I like best for that. So go ahead and add the crack filler, and then I like to work it in with a putty knife to make sure that it fills that void. Really, no crack is too small to utilize this. After a few minutes, it will have kind of worked its way into the crack, so I like to go ahead and add a second layer. I'm going to do the epoxy in 2 sections so I don't have to move everything out of my garage. So I've taped off the part I'm not doing now, and I'm using this product called Armor Epoxy, which I did a lot of research on. I'm doing a whole separate video about why I chose this, and you can find a link to it in my description below. It comes in a kit that provides pretty much everything you'll need. Before you buy your epoxy, you'll need to know how much to buy. And here's where I suggest you overestimate, because the coverage that epoxy kits provide is based on the quality of your concrete. Now, we just resurfaced it, so the quality should be better. but I would still err on the side of overestimating. Most kits start at 300 square feet, and that is not enough to do a standard 2-car garage. By the way, this video is not sponsored by any of the products you're seeing me use here. However, if you click the links that I'm putting in the description below, I will get credit if you decide to go buy something. So that's a nice way you can support the channel. Of course, in addition to subscribing, is using the links below or on buildingwithblake.com. The epoxy comes in 2 parts. Part A is the epoxy, part B is the hardener, and you mix them in a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts epoxy to 1 part hardener. Start by giving part A a little shake so that you're sure it's pre-mixed. I bought a 600 square foot kit, and Armor Epoxy recommends you don't use more than half of it at a time. It would have been nice if the bottles had measurements marked on them. Of course they didn't, so I figured out the fill level of each one and then marked about halfway up on the bottle. I thought that was kind of brilliant, but after I poured the epoxy in the bucket, I couldn't find the new fill level because that stuff is just so thick and it coats the inside. So I had to use the dipstick method. I just took one of these paint stirring sticks and I dipped it in there to see how high up the epoxy now came. And I needed to add just a little bit more to get about half. The hardener was much easier to measure because the bottle was clear. I should also point out it is thinner, so don't pour too fast. You're only using half as much hardener as the epoxy you just poured. Now, if I had to do this again, I would not have mixed up half of the container at once. They say the working time, once you've got the hardener in there, is about 20 minutes, and that is nerve-wracking. It goes by real quick, and you just don't know how easily this stuff is going to spread, so I probably would have only done a quarter of it at a time. And they say to mix this for about 3 minutes. I think that's probably a little too much because the clock is ticking, right now. You want to mix it until all of that veining is gone and you've worked all the sides, the top and then the bottom of the bucket. Once everything looks uniform, you're pretty much ready to go. You can pour this right on the floor. Don't pour too much until you get a feel for how easily it spreads. They say you can use either a roller or a squeegee. I started with the roller and I regretted it. Epoxy is thicker than paint and it requires you to apply a fair amount of pressure. This roller was not up to the task and it also soaked up a lot of that precious epoxy that I wish I could have back. Once I wised up, I switched over to the squeegee, which is just a much finer tuned implement because you can kind of grab the edge of your epoxy puddle and scrape it in one direction, then grab the other edge and scrape it in another direction, and then just kind of keep doing that until you've fanned it out over across the floor. You can use the squeegee to work it up against the walls. You don't even have to use a brush like I started doing. Another thing I wish I had done was to add just a little bit of a thinning agent to the mix before I put it on the floor. Just about a half a cup of this stuff will help it spread a lot easier. And by the way, the kit came with these cleats you can strap onto your shoes, which will allow you to walk across the epoxy while it's still wet. Here is an area that I did not resurface, and you can see it's still a bit porous, and I'm having trouble working the epoxy into those pores for 2 reasons. One is the epoxy is too thick to settle into those pockets like paint would, and the other is that there's air trapped in there that has to escape, and because the epoxy is thicker, the air has a hard time breaking the surface. For the detail work, I used a putty knife, and I could scrape the epoxy right up against the doors and the walls, and the opening of the garage where I was able to get a nice clean edge using the putty knife. Now for the spreading of decorative flakes. Hooray! Wait 24 hours, then sweep up any flakes that didn't stick. And next it's time for the top coat. And this is important not just for the added protection, but also to seal in those colorful flakes so that they don't break free. Stir it up well, just like you would for any paint or polyurethane. And then you can add the anti-slip powder, which just helps prevent foot slips on the epoxy, which can get slippery once it's really cured, and especially if it's wet. And this is a really fine powder. It's not sandy or grainy. You're barely going to notice that it's there. Just kind of mix it in a little bit at a time. And then as you continue to apply the top coat, just give it a little stir here and there to prevent this stuff from settling on the bottom of the can. The top coat is much thinner than the epoxy. So much thinner that it basically jumps right out of the can and makes a mess if you're not ready for it. And for this layer, you do want to use a paint roller and a paint tray, just like any other paint. I found that it's kind of similar to polyacrylic if you've ever used that. It has about the same consistency. And because it goes on so thin and it's clear, it can be kind of difficult to see. So I just sectioned my garage off into different parts and tried to block it out that way and just kind of squinted, and sometimes you can see it if you catch it in the right light. And once this is down, wait at least 24 hours for foot traffic and 3 to 5 days for vehicle traffic per the instructions.
There's a couple things I didn't do during this project, one of which is etch the floor. Basically anywhere that your concrete has previously been sealed, you want to add some etching to create a more porous surface for the epoxy to adhere to. Mix a little bit of this powder in a bucket with some warm water, spread it on there for 5 to 10 minutes and then wash it off again. And you'll know that your concrete was previously sealed if it looks a little bit shiny. Anywhere that is a little dull probably has worn off. Most of my concrete that's still sealed is around the perimeter where I'm not going to be having really any traffic. I'm just going to be setting up shelves. Another thing is priming, and that's something you don't have to do to the entire floor necessarily, but some areas that you think could be problematic. For example, grease stains that you couldn't get out, kind of like this area right here. You can see that it hasn't adhered perfectly smooth and even to this spot right here. So we'll see if this holds up or not. Any areas that you were not able to resurface or still might have some pitting in them, potential areas for priming. Priming is a little bit more expensive, but probably worth it if you have areas that you're concerned about.
For some reason, my kit did not include instructions, which are pretty important because no matter how good this YouTube video is, there's still a lot of little stuff that I probably missed, and you should follow the manufacturer's instructions. Fortunately, they're pretty easy to download, and I'll put a link to these in the description below along with all the other stuff.
If your floor is damp, meaning moisture is seeping up through the slab or it's kind of coming through the walls on a regular basis, that's a really important place to prime because the epoxy is just not going to adhere consistently to that area. There is a moisture test you can do, but if you're seeing regular moisture on your concrete, I mean, you know you've got it, so you might as well just prime that area. Well, I hope you found this helpful. As always, I try to get right into the important information at the beginning and save the chatty stuff till the end. I'm also always happy to admit my mistakes because after all, I am a DIY guy. I'm not an expert. If you were to talk to an expert about this project, they would probably tell you to hire an expert. But that's not why you're here. If there's anything noteworthy as this continues to, age and wear over the years, I'll do an update and I'll let you know. In the meantime, thanks for building with me today. I'll see you on the next project.